to the King.
Let's welcome Ken and encourage him.
Good evening. Could everybody take a big deep breath and hold it? That'll help you relax. Okay. Actually, that breath was courtesy of Jesus Christ. I used to say that and mean it, but I really mean it now. I think it was this day last year. I was in a Learjet, my own little Learjet. You know the type that Bex and Posh go on holiday in. One of those little jets that flies at about 50,000 feet. I had it all to myself with just a doctor and nurse, courtesy of the National Health Service. And when you're strapped to machines to keep you alive, and the Lord brings you out of that, you really, really, really know that every heartbeat and every breath is courtesy of Jesus Christ, the risen Son, through whom all things were made, by whom, through whom, and in whom all things are held together. That's the truth. That's the truth. Anyway, you'll hear more about that next week. The fact that I'm standing here is a miracle, absolutely. The last time I was at the hospital about a month ago, they told me for the first time that only 10% of my heart was working, and asked me could I walk up 3 steps without getting out of breath. Asked me could I lie on my back and breathe. So I was able to tell them I'd been up the Mourne Mountains, said I could do a length of the swimming pool underwater, and I've done a full circumference of a football pitch at a run without stopping, and I'm 58, so they're now thinking something must have happened. One nurse said you should be on a television because these things just don't happen. So there we go. Anyway, I trust that this teaching tonight will inspire you and encourage you, because we do go through hard times. We just do. Jesus said, in this life you will have troubles, and he wasn't cursing us. He was just telling us, this is not heaven, this is life. And there's warfare just there all the time against your mind, your family, your marriage, your finances, whatever. The world, the flesh, and the devil, they just wear at you like sandpaper all the time. Often it's not the one big thing that knocks you down, or even the second big thing. Often it's just the sandpaper of life that just wears you down until you feel like giving up. And some people do, and some people don't. Whenever I was at school, it's embarrassing to say this, but I didn't enjoy school, and therefore I chose not to work at it. I was in the days whenever they did junior, and at junior 80% of people passed. I was one of the 20% who failed. And it was not a surprise because I went fishing on the days of the exam. I couldn't just think what was the purpose of being humiliated when the paper was set in front of me, so I took some of the class with me fishing. It's okay, I was duly reprimanded for it. But then the next year, they brought GCEs in, so I ended up doing junior and GCE, the exam that came in to replace it. And it was much better because if you passed something, you got a GCE, and there was great pressure on me to get a GCE. And I was quite good at English and art. But English was split into 2, English language and English literature. And the literature bit I had no interest in. They just gave us a pile of books. Anyway, there was pressure on me to get a GCE, so with about a month to go, I decided I'd better read at least one of the books. And so there was a book there by a man who I only knew as a boring politician, Winston Churchill. It was called My Early Life. And of the 2 books, it looked mildly more interesting. So at 15, I think it was, I began to read My Early Life. And it absolutely gripped me. I wasn't expecting that. It absolutely gripped me. Here was a young man who was over in the Sudan in the last horse charge of the British Empire, fighting the dervishes hand to hand in the Boer War as a journalist for the Morning Post, captured, escaped, reward put on his head. It was such an action story. Well, from that moment onwards, I was fascinated by Winston Churchill. And fortunately, my dad knew lots about him, so I asked endless questions about him. And I suppose I was pleased in November 2002 when the nation voted Winston Churchill the greatest Briton of all time. And it wasn't because he was a great politician or a writer of history. He wrote so many books. He was a great painter as well. He was even a bricklayer. It was for what he did for Britain during the war, during the darkest hours of the war, whenever Britain just suffered defeat after defeat after defeat. And Dunkirk had just happened. And it just seemed as if Britain's spirit was about to break. But this man seemed to have an indomitable spirit. I believe he was raised up by God for such a day, although he would not have acknowledged that it was God, but I believe it was God. Cometh the hour, cometh the man. May the 10th, over 1,500 civilians died in London alone from the bombing, and Britain just seemed to have no answer. And yet one of his speeches, "We shall not flag or fail. We shall go on to the end. We shall fight in France. We shall fight on the seas and oceans. We shall fight with growing confidence and growing strength in the air. We shall defend our island, whatever the cost may be. We shall fight on the beaches. We shall fight on the landing grounds. We shall fight in the fields and in the streets. We shall fight in the hills. We shall never surrender." And yet, really, in truth, Britain was really lying on its back. But this man kept holding hope of victory before the nation, and they responded. When news of another defeat would come in and everybody else was despairing, he would say, "Another challenge." Speaking at his old school Harrow in October 1941, he said this to his old school. He said, "Never give in. Never, 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 never. In nothing great or small, large or petty, never give in except to convictions of honour and good sense. Never yield to force. Never yield to the apparently overwhelming might of the enemy." That was his whole theme, never give in. And there was 2 books brought out about him, and both actually used the same title, Never Give In, because that just summed the man up. Toward the end of his life, he was speaking at a university in England, and his car was late arriving. The crowds jostled as the great man came towards the stage, and finally, in a gruff voice, he spoke just 12 words. "Never give up. Never, never, never give up. Never give up." And then he sat down. You see, he had the right to say that because he had lived it. That was the secret of his, what I believe was God-given strength. He never gave up. He kept his eyes on victory all the time, and he never took them off that hope. But Hitler and Mussolini are dead. The war lasted 5 or 6 years, and it was over. But there's a bigger war going on all the time, the war for our very souls, for the souls of people. And until we reach heaven, the world, the flesh, and the devil run contrary to us day in and day out. And I have no doubt that there's people here right now who are going through their darkest hour. And day in, day out, Satan would say to you, "Give up. Come on, give up. Enough's enough. Just turn around and walk away." And when we break in spirit, we become greatly discouraged, and can so often, like a virus, begin discouraging others. What are we doing? This isn't working. This is bringing nothing but hassle. Well, let me tell you that the Apostle Paul would say to us tonight, never, never, never give up. In fact, he did say this, and this is just a compilation taken from 1 Corinthians 4:11 to 13, 2 Corinthians 11:23 to 28, Acts 20:24, and 2 Timothy 4-7. Just a compilation of things that he said. He said this, "To this present hour we are both hungry and thirsty, and are poorly clothed, and are roughly treated, and are homeless, and we toil, working with our own hands. When we are reviled, we bless. When we are persecuted, we endure. When we are slandered, we try to conciliate. We have become as the scum of the world, the dregs of all things, even until now. In far more labors, in far more imprisonments, beaten, times without number, often in dangers of death. 5 times I received from the Jews 39 lashes. 3 times I was beaten with rods. Once I was stoned. 3 times I was shipwrecked. A night and a day I have spent in the deep. I have been on frequent journeys, in dangers from rivers, dangers from robbers, dangers from countrymen, dangers from the Gentiles, dangers in the city, dangers in the wilderness, dangers on the sea, dangers amongst false brethren. I have been in labor and hardship, through many sleepless nights, in hunger and thirst, often without food, in cold and exposure. Apart from such external things, there is a daily pressure on me of concern for all the churches. But I do not consider my life of any account as dear to myself, so that I may finish my course and the ministry which I have received from the Lord Jesus. I have fought the good fight. I've finished the course. I've kept the faith." Wouldn't that make a great tract to hand out in the streets? But it's truth. If you would serve Jesus, if you would follow Jesus, everything that God does will be challenged. We love the stories in the book of Acts when God was moving, and sometimes we forget it was in the midst of terrible persecution. The early rain, it'll be the same. I believe this is the beginning of the latter rain, and so God will be doing more and more and more. But it'll be in the midst of that being challenged more and more and more and more. And sometimes I think Christians, we're poised for sunshine, which is nice in the physical, but it's important, I think, to know that there are difficult days ahead. The best of days and the worst of days, I believe, are coming down the line. Peter would say to us, never, never give up. In fact, he did say us, beloved. Isn't it lovely to be called beloved instead of hey you? Beloved, do not be surprised at the fiery ordeal among you, which comes upon you for your testing, as though some strange thing were happening to you, but to the degree that you share the sufferings of Christ, keep on rejoicing, so that at the revelation of his glory you may rejoice with exultation. If you are reviled for the name of Christ, you are blessed, because the Spirit of glory and of God rests upon you. 1 Peter 4:12-14. The writer of Hebrews would say, never, never, never give up. In fact, he did say, you have not yet resisted to the point of shedding blood in your striving against sin. Remember Terry Virgo telling a story at Together for the Kingdom conference away in Butlins in 91, I think it was. And he said that there was a man in his church who was continually unfaithful to his wife, committing adultery all the time. And he always said when he was caught, I'm so sorry, and his wife forgave him. And he just said, I can't help it. The sin is too big for me. The sin is too strong for me. I fight it, but it wins all the time. And Terry Virgo said there was a man who came to the church one day who had a very powerful gift in the Holy Spirit of words of knowledge. And during the first service in the church, he was speaking things into people's lives that were just totally remarkable. And at the end of the service, he said to Terry Virgo, God has shown me there's a man in this church who keeps committing adultery again and again and again. And Terry said, that's right. He said, well, could I go and see him? I've got a word for the Lord for him. So Terry took him along and knocked on the door. And he was invited in, and they had a cup of tea. And the man says, well, why are you here? And Terry Virgo introduced this man, and this man says, I believe that you continually commit adultery. The man said, oh, it's just too strong for me. Oh, the temptations are too strong. And he went on excusing himself. And the man said, well, I've got a word for the Lord from you. Yes, what is it? He says, well, if you do it again, he'll kill you. Terry Virgo says, remarkably, he never did it again. The temptation wasn't just that strong at all. You have not yet resisted to the point of shedding blood in your striving against sin. The Apostle James would say, never, never give up. In fact, he did say, blessed is the man who perseveres under trial, because when he has stood the test, he will receive the crown of life that God has promised to those who love him. Way back in 1987, this is very much the shortened version, but I took part in the World Championship triathlon in Nice in the south of France. It's a long story how I got there, but I'd started off just doing jogging around Newton Ards and eventually started to run 10Ks, ended up doing marathons, and anyway, eventually went into triathlons and became friends with the All-Ireland champion. And he was going to do the World Championships in France, so I went with him and signed on for it. And anyway, it was a 2-mile sea swim, a 77-mile cycle, and a 20-mile run non-stop. And of course, it was way beyond my abilities, and after a short time, the organisers told me the race for me was over. So I took off my number, but I kept on going, and I had arguments at every stage. They tried to block me, and I argued with them in French, and they eventually let me go as a non-contestant with no number. And eventually the race closed down at 5 o'clock at night, and I was still some 15 miles from home, and they took away all the tables. And then darkness came down, and I was the only person that all closed up. And eventually it started at 9 o'clock in the morning, and at 6:10 that night, this pathetic figure crossed the line in the darkness at France, and all was left was the scaffolding and a porta-cabin. The crowds had long gone home. And this lady came out in sort of broken English, said, have you just finished? And I said, yes, but I'm out of the race. So she got me and sort of nearly physically dragged me to a porta-cabin, and loud voices began to speak in French to these people. And what was your number? So I gave her my number, and then eventually I staggered out, and it took me 2 hours to get a 1 mile back to my B&B, still in my shorts, hanging onto lampposts and brick walls as I'd seized up. But amazingly, a month later, a parcel from France arrived, and they sent me a World Championship medal. The reason was, despite all their rules and regulations, they broke their own rules and regulations. The World Championship Committee broke their own rules because they were so impressed that somebody just wouldn't give up. They actually sent a motorbike at one stage out to bring me in, and I nearly had a fight with them. They sent a bus out to bring me in. They did. In the middle of the traffic, a bus stopped, and they started shouting at me in French. I had to get in, and I refused. And despite all their anger, they gave me a medal. So I'm proud of it, but I'm aware that it's a perishable, earthbound medal. Paul said everyone who competes in the games goes into strict training. They do it for a crown that will not last, but we do it to get a crown that will last forever. And of course, Jesus, the author and finisher of our faith, would say to us, never, never, never give up. We know the story of Gethsemane. Oh, my Father, if this cup cannot pass away from me, but your will be done. And the Bible tells us that Jesus endured the pain and the naked shame of the cross for the joy that was set before him. What was that joy that was set before him? Do you know what I used to think? It was the joy of getting out of here and getting back to heaven. I thought that would do me for a joy. But I actually realized that was not the case. You and I are the joy. You and I were the medal. You and I were what he had his eyes fixed on. You see, if your eyes aren't fixed on something precious, you will give up. If your eyes are fixed on getting the next model of car or the next holiday, something happens, you'll give up. But when your eyes are fixed on something bigger and greater and mightier and more wonderful than yourself, you will get that strength that will keep you going over mountains and valleys through night and day. And if you don't have that, you'll give up very easily. 99% of all failure comes from giving up too soon. Listen to this paraphrase from John Wesley's journal. May the 5th a.m. preached in St. Anne's was asked not to come back. May the 5th, these are all same days, May the 5th p.m. preached at St. John's, deacon said get out and stay out. The next Sunday, May the 12th a.m., preached at St. Jude's, can't go back there. May the 12th p.m., preached at St. George's, kicked out again. May the 19th a.m., preached at St. Andrew's, elders called a special meeting and told me not to return. May the 19th p.m., preached in the street, was run out of town. May the 26th a.m., preached in a field, got chased by a bull that was let loose. May the 2nd a.m., preached at the edge of town, police moved me on. Wouldn't you be thinking at this stage, it's about time I went home and gave up? I mean, you would, all the signs would be pointing at it. But that evening, June the 2nd p.m., preached in a pasture and 10,000 came to hear me. If Wesley had given up, what would have happened? If Paul had given up, if James had given up, if Jesus had given up, we are here because so many people, ordinary people, just never give up. I want to tell this story that David Wilkerson told. It's from the Times Square Pulpit series, February the 16th, 1998. This is what he said. He said, not long ago I picked up a missionary biography entitled Aggie, A-G-G-I-E, and I couldn't put it down. This amazing story gripped my heart, and I ended up reading it at one sitting. In 1921, two young couples in Stockholm, Sweden, answered God's call to the African mission field. They were members of Philadelphia Pentecostal Church, which sent out missionaries all over the world. During one mission service, these two couples received a burden to go to the Belgian Congo, which is now Zaire. Their names were David and Svea Flood, and Joel and Bertha Eriksson. Svea Flood was only 4 feet 8 inches tall, and she was a well-known singer in Sweden, but both couples gave up everything to lay down their lives for the gospel. When they arrived in the Belgian Congo, they reported to the local mission station. Then they took machetes and literally hacked their way into the Congo's insect-infested interior. David and Svea had a 2-year-old son, David Jr., and they had to carry him on their backs. Along the way, both families caught malaria, but they kept going forward with great zeal, ready to be martyrs for the Lord. Finally, they reached a certain village in the interior, yet to their surprise, the people would not let them enter. They told the missionaries, "We cannot allow any white people here or our gods will be offended." So the families went to a second village, but they were rejected there also. At this point, there were no other villages around. The worn-down families had no choice but to settle. So they hacked out a clearing in the middle of a mountain jungle and built mud huts, which they made their homes. As the months went by, they all suffered from loneliness, sickness, and malnutrition. Little David Jr. became sickly, and they had almost no interaction with any of the local villagers. Finally, after about 6 months, Joel and Bertha Erickson decided to return to the mission station. They urged the Floods to do the same, but Svea couldn't travel because she'd just found out that she was pregnant. And now her malaria had become worse. Besides all that, David said, "I want my child born in Africa. I have come to give my life here." So the Flood simply waved goodbye as their friends began the 100-mile hike back through the jungle. For several months, Svea endured a raging fever. Yet at that time, she ministered faithfully to a little boy who came to see them from one of the nearby villages. The boy was the Flood's only convert. He brought the family fruit, and as Svea ministered to him, he simply smiled back at her. Eventually, Svea's malaria got so bad she became bedridden. When the time came for her to give birth, she delivered a healthy baby girl. But within a week, she was at the point of death. In her final moments, she whispered to David, "Call our girl Anya." Then she died. David Flood was greatly shaken by his wife's death. Summoning all his strength, he took a wooden box and made a casket for Svea. Then, in a primitive grave on the mountainside, he buried his beloved wife. As he stood beside her grave, he looked down at his young son beside him. Then he heard his baby daughter's cries from the mud hut, and suddenly bitterness filled his heart. An anger rose up in him, and he couldn't control it. He flew into a rage, crying, "Why did you allow this, God? We came here to give our lives. My wife was so beautiful, so talented, and here she lies dead at 27 years of age. Now I have a 2-year-old son I can hardly care for, let alone a baby girl. And after more than a year in this jungle, all we have to show for it is one little village boy who probably doesn't even understand a word we've said to him. You've failed me, God. What a waste of lives." At that point, David Flood hired some local tribesmen as guides and took his children to the mission station. When he saw the Ericksons there, he blurted out angrily, "I'm leaving. I can't handle these children alone. I'm taking my son with me back to Sweden, but I'm leaving my daughter here with you." And with that, he left Anya for the Ericksons to raise. All the way back to Stockholm, David Flood stood on deck and seethed at God. He had told everyone he was going to Africa to be a martyr, to win people to Christ, no matter what the cost. And now he was returning a defeated and broken man. He believed he had been faithful, but that God had rewarded him with total neglect. When he arrived at Stockholm, he decided to go into the import business to seek his fortune, and he warned everyone around him never to mention the name of God in his presence. When they did, he flew into a rage, the veins popping out on his neck. Eventually, he began drinking heavily. Shortly after he left Africa, his friends, the Ericksons, died suddenly. Possibly, it says, poisoned by a local village chief. So little Anya was handed over to an American couple, some dear people, he said, David Wilkerson said he knew, called Arthur and Anna Berg. The Bergs took Anya with them to a village called Masisi in the northern Congo. There they began calling her Aggie, and soon little Aggie learned the Swahili language and played with the Congo children. Alone much of the time, Aggie learned to play games of imagination. She imagined she had 4 brothers and a sister, and she gave them all imaginary names. She would set a table for her brothers and talk to them, and she would imagine her sister continually looking for her. When the Bergs went on furlough to America, they took Aggie with them to the Minneapolis area. As it turned out, they ended up staying there. Aggie grew up to marry a man called Dewey Hurst. who later became president of Northwest Bible College, the Assemblies of God school in Minneapolis. Aggie never knew that her father had remarried, this time to Svea's younger sister, who had no heart for God. And now he had 5 children besides Aggie, 4 sons and a daughter, just as Aggie had imagined. By this time, David Flood had become a total alcoholic, and his eyesight was failing badly. For 40 years, Aggie tried to locate her father, but her letters were never answered. Finally, the Bible school gave her and her husband round-trip tickets to Sweden. This would give her the chance to find her father personally. After crossing the Atlantic, the couple spent a day's layover in London. They decided to take a walk, so they strolled by the Royal Albert Hall. To their joy, a Pentecostal Assemblies of God missions convention was being held inside. They went inside, where they heard a black preacher testifying of the great works that God was doing in Zaire, the Belgian Congo. Aggie's heart leapt. After the meeting, she approached the preacher and asked, "Did you ever know the missionaries David and Svea Flood?" He answered, "Yes. Svea Flood led me to the Lord when I was a little boy. They had a baby girl, but I don't know what happened to her." Aggie exclaimed, "I'm the girl. I'm Aggie. Anya." When the preacher heard this, he clasped Aggie's hands, hugged her, and wept with joy. Aggie could hardly believe that this man was the little boy convert her mother had ministered to. He had grown up to be a missionary evangelist to his own country, which now included 110,000 Christians, 32 mission stations, several Bible schools, and a 120-bed hospital. The next day, Aggie and Dewey left for Stockholm, and word had spread there that they were coming. By this time, Aggie knew that she had 4 brothers and a sister. And to her surprise, 3 of her brothers greeted her at the hotel. She asked them, "Where's David, my older brother?" They merely pointed across the lobby to a lone figure sitting in a chair. Her brother, David Jr., was a shriveled-up, grey-haired man. Like his father, he had grown embittered and had nearly destroyed his life with alcohol. When Aggie asked about her father, her brothers flushed with anger. They all hated him. None of them had talked to him for years. Then Aggie asked, "What about my sister?" They gave her a telephone number, and Aggie called it immediately. Her sister answered, but when Aggie told her who she was, the line suddenly went dead. Aggie tried calling back, but got no answer. In a little while, however, her sister arrived at the hotel and threw her arms around Aggie. She told her, "All my life I've dreamed about you. I used to spread out a map of the world, put a toy car on it, and pretend to drive everywhere to find you." Aggie's sister also despised her father, David Flood, but she promised to help Aggie find him. So they drove to an impoverished area of Stockholm, where they entered a rundown building. When they knocked on the door, a woman let them in. Inside, liquor bottles lay everywhere. And lying on a cot in the corner was her father, the one-time missionary David Flood. He was now 73 years old and suffering from diabetes. He had also had a stroke, and cataracts covered both eyes. Aggie fell to his side crying, "Dad, I'm your little girl, the one you left in Africa." The old man turned and looked at her. Tears formed in his eyes. He answered, "I never meant to give you away. I just couldn't handle you both." Aggie answered, "That's okay, Daddy. God took care of me." Suddenly her father's face darkened. "God didn't take care of you," he raged. "He ruined our whole family. He led us to Africa and then betrayed us. Nothing ever came out of our time there. It was a waste of our lives." Aggie then told him about the black preacher she'd just met in London and how the country had been evangelized through him. "It's all true, Daddy. Everybody knows about that little boy convert. The story has been in all the newspapers." Suddenly the Holy Spirit fell on David Flood and he broke. Tears of sorrow and repentance flowed down his face, and God restored him. Shortly after their meeting, David Flood died. And although he was restored to the Lord, he left only ruin behind. Besides Aggie, his legacy was 5 children, all unsaved and tragically embittered. Aggie wrote down the whole story. As she worked on it, she developed cancer, and just after finished writing it, she went to be with the Lord. Dear Christian brother, dear Christian sister, dear Christian husband, dear Christian wife, dear Christian mother, dear Christian father, dear Christian pastor, never, never, never give up.
My word. Let's just pray, shall we? We'll lead us in a song in a moment or two, but let's just bow before God.